The content of this episode is for informational and educational purposes only and reflects the opinions and research of the host, contributors, and guests. While every effort has been made to ensure the accuracy of the information presented, the producers of Varied Voices make no guarantees regarding its completeness or reliability. The statements, testimonials, and correspondences discussed in this episode are based on publicly available information, personal interviews, and personal correspondence. Any references to individuals, organizations, or entities are based on facts at the time of recording and are not intended to defame, disparage, or harm their reputation. This episode may include graphic content, opinions, and interpretations that some listeners may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised. The views expressed by guests and contributors are their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the producers or hosts of Varied Voices. The producers and hosts assume no responsibility or liability for actions taken by listeners based on the content of this episode. Listeners are encouraged to do their own research and consult with appropriate professionals if they seek legal, psychological, or other expert advice. Imagine corresponding with Fred Waterfield,
the only living cousin of this duo.
And this convicted serial killer claims that he was framed. And every time you try to ask, how did it go? Like, maybe you are innocent. Let's just entertain the thought. He just dodges the question and goes into these crazy delusions.
Yes, his conspiracy theories.
So tell me about your letters, Patty, with Fred.
Sure. I thought when we decided to do this true crime series, I thought it would be great if I could write to Fred Waterfield and maybe get some insights from him. I think that I was hoping that there'd be some remorse, that even possibly we may be able to find other victims that had yet to be found. But what ended up happening from the first letter, so I wrote to Fred just telling him that we were host of Varied Voices podcast and that we felt that his voice would be an important one to listen to. And we wanted to hear what he had to say. And he wrote us back, and it was a handwritten letter. And I must say, you and I both marveled at the penmanship was exquisite. I mean, truly. You could tell that Fred Waterfield was quite brilliant. I mean, really. Anyone that I have ever talked to about this case that knew the cousins said that he was the brains behind the operation and that Gore he was able to tell Gore what to do and Gore would do it. And I think after corresponding with Fred Waterfield, I think I got a sense of that too, because he is definitely, you can tell that he has a high level of intelligence. And so the first letter we got, basically, he told us that, this was a case that was going to blow our mind because of the conspiracies to convict. And he just went on and on, which if you didn't know any better, you would have been drawn in. But then you kind of have to say, well, wait, is this making any sense? Which is what I did when I responded to him. I wanted to narrow down some of these accusations that he was saying. So I wrote him back and I thanked him for the letter and sharing his thoughts and experiences, and I appreciated his openness and willingness to communicate with us. I said it was intriguing hearing about the challenges that he had faced and the unique circumstances of his case. And I told him, yes, growing up in the same hometown, I've certainly heard many stories, and his perspective adds a new layer of insights. And I said to him, I can only imagine how frustrating it must be for you and the people involved. And I told him I would love to continue our conversation and get to know more about his experiences. I told him I had signed up on Securious, which was a way that we could email back and forth, and which would allow him to write me back. So I asked him some pointed questions. Can you give me the dates of the 2 death-qualified jury trials that he said were not on record that had happened, and confirm that the trials were held in Lake County? I was trying to make it sound like, okay, I'm listening, but give me a little more than just a carrot with no end, in sight to finding out if what he was even saying was true. And I told him that I had requested the old case files from Indian River Sheriff's Department, which I just want to say that they have been so open. And as a matter of fact, Lieutenant Michael Pierce sat with me late one night going through all the files. So there has been no cover up there. I just want to say that. And I told him it would be helpful if he could bullet point on what he felt he was responsible for regarding the crimes and what he denied responsibility for. I got a whole essay of, again, more conspiracy theories. And, he went on about how one attorney who tried to help was sued by another attorney who's now the assistant state attorney. And so with that, I'm like, okay, let me just look up that case. I did not find that case. What I did find, which I thought was interesting, was Waterfield versus the state. And this goes on to explain that he has put out, basically he petitioned the courts, and I don't know all the legal mambo jumbo, but what would you say? That's 6 inches of filings of frivolous lawsuits that he has put to the courts, and that's only some of them, they say. And when it got down to the end of this, it said, we dismiss this appeal as frivolous and procedurally improper. We also caution Waterfield that another frivolous filing will result in sanctions. So they've had it with him, So
he has a lot of free time in there.
It was. So I kept, trying to placate, to try to get him to open up to me from anything from asking him, about his earlier years. I tried to reach him by getting to know him from when he was a youth. I understood that he was popular and had friends and he played on the football team, whereas Gore was quite the opposite, that he was an introvert. And, I wanted him to tell me about those times. I asked him about his family and how this had affected them, and did he stay in touch with them, and how old were his twin daughters now, and, just trying to pull out something other than looping back into this nonsense of these conspiracy theories. And he would go right back to that. Maybe he would touch on a little bit. I also asked him, please tell us why you are innocent of the crimes. That's what is going to get the attention of the public. Why are you innocent of what you've been charged on? So one thing that he said when he wrote me back in this letter, he tried to touch on that. He said, the young lady that I was charged with kidnapping gave 3 statements to the police and a deposition clearly stating that I did nothing to make her believe I was involved in the crimes.
And this is Regan Martin he's referring to?
Yeah. And you and I read his testimony in Waterfield's trial, right?
Yep.
Okay. So let's just touch on that. So I've got that page here from the trial, and I think it's important. So Redstone, who is the prosecutor, asked a question. Was the guy I'm sorry, this is a detective. So sorry, this is Phil Redstone. So this actually is not from trial. This was the day after Lynn Elliott was killed and Regan Martin was being interviewed, the survivor in those abductions. So Phil Redstone asked, was the guy driving the truck seem like he was scared or upset, or did it seem like he was going along with the guy with the gun? Now understand, just so we put this in perspective, so Waterfield was driving the truck. Lynn Elliott was sitting next to Waterfield, and then there was Regan Martin, and then there was David Gore. And when the glove box fell open, David Gore grabbed the gun. And so this was the question in regards to that. Did he know what was going on? And Martin answered it. Regan Martin said, well, he didn't. I don't think they planned on it. But he went along with it. He didn't try to stop him. So she didn't testify 3 times to anything. As a matter of fact, I've heard an audio tape of her statements, and never did she say that Waterfield was innocent in this crime. And then, of course, this is from the day after Lynn Elliott was murdered and she had been abducted.
Yeah, she was clearly confused in the moment, but in no way was she saying, no, he was innocent.
Right. And if we remember the story of Regan Martin and Lynn Elliott that we told, they split them up, one in one room and one in the other. And it was Gore that was molesting her, and Waterfield was in with Lynn Elliott. And then at some point, Gore left Regan Martin and went into the room with Waterfield and Lynn. His detail of that is alarming. But Waterfield ended up, in the chaos of Lynn getting away, he took off, right? He never got a chance to go in and molest Regan. So she was being truthful, but yeah, as she said, he did nothing to stop it. He drove them to the house. There are times when he starts to become very testy with me, when I really...
This is August 1st, 2024. Hello, Patricia. Thank you for the response. You asked the right questions, and I will do my best to guide you safely through this matter.
You notice how he, again, safely, in a way trying to scare us that there's a cover-up.
Exactly, like very conspiratorial.
Yeah.
The young lady's name is Regan Martin. The young lady's name that was murdered is Lynn Elliott. Lynn's boyfriend at the time was Timothy McCullers. At the pretrial hearings from July 27th, 1983 to April 15th, 1984, over 30 witnesses were called at various motion proceedings. It provided a courtroom drama that far exceeded anything produced by Hollywood. In August of 1983, the prosecution realized that I had a source of income that allowed me to acquire private counsel. Their reaction was to cut me off from this source of income. They were following and harassing everyone they could link to me in order to find out how to cut me off from the money. Once the prosecution realized I was the president of a corporation and also the president of 3 other corporations, like what corporation?
I don't know. I only know of 2 shops he had, one in Orlando and one in Vero. He may have had a tow truck that was a division of one of them. I'm not sure.
What Mr. Stone did was call those banks and directed the banks to freeze those accounts in a criminal investigation. No warrants were issued by a court to freeze those corporation accounts. 28 employees found themselves out of work because the corporation was unable to pay them. Mr. Stone told the media that I had paid David from those corporate accounts by check to kidnap women for me. This was the basis of freezing those accounts. Those accounts remained frozen for 5 months until I was able to prove David did not, in fact, receive any checks.
Now, and let me just say, Stephanie, if you remember in the transcript, they had asked what bank it was written from and what bank he cashed it out at, which was First Bankers, and it was through his parents' account. So we do know that whether or not they were able to link those checks to this or not, I don't know. But I mean, it's interesting anyways.
The custodian of records for Barnett's Bank entered every personal and corporate check I had written dating back to 1972.
Did he say Barnett Bank?
Yeah.
Okay, well, it wasn't Barnett Bank in this transcript. Okay, it was a bank I'd never heard of in Orlando, and then First Bankers. So that's interesting.
The custodian of record for Barnett's Bank entered every personal and corporate check I had written dating back to 1972 in an evidentiary proceedings.
So again, can I say that Barnett Bank wasn't even mentioned in the transcript? So if that be the case, if he had an account at Barnett Bank, maybe it wouldn't have shown there. But he's not mentioning the banks that were actually mentioned in the transcript at trial. Interesting.
On January 18th, 1984, Judge Vosell ordered those accounts to be opened. I filed suit in the Southern U.S. District Court to recover the damages to those corporations from Mr. Stone et al. The suits were dismissed by federal court, claiming I was an overly litigious prisoner.
Gore testified that Waterfield was paying for him to abduct girls for the purpose of rape, murder, and it appears that he was just, that's what he was doing. He was capturing them, and then he would call his cousin. So let's back up and talk about when we had read about how Fred Waterfield asked David Gore if he wanted to make some extra money.
So in Gore's statement at Waterfield's trial, he's asked about a conversation he had with Waterfield. And he says, well, the conversation got started like, I was interested in making some extra money, and he told me that he had a way that I could make some money if I really was sincere about it. And then he proceeded to tell me, you know, he wanted some young, good-looking females. I could pick them up, kidnap them for him. That's basically how the conversation got started. And so he was asked, so was this just out of the blue? And David says yes. When did this conversation take place? It would have been in the fall of 1980, according to this statement. So this transaction that they agreed upon, the first one were the Lang women. And it was Fred's intention to pay the $1,000 to David for the young 17-year-old Ling.
Right. When David kidnapped the 17-year-old Ling girl and the mother, Fred Waterfield was upset about that because he just wanted young girls. So in his mind, he only owed him $1,000 for Ling. So when Judith K. Daly was picked up and Waterfield was called and he drove down to Vero from Orlando and saw her, he says, okay. He gave partial payment in cash and he wrote a $1,500 check, which is what Waterfield was trying to say to me that at Barnett Bank, they had gone through that and they couldn't prove it because there was nothing in Barnett Bank, which he's trying to act like that's what his business, his corporate account was. Well, here's from the transcripts. Okay, so this is Gore at testifying. He says, I put it in my wallet the day, I believe it was the next day, I went up to the First Citrus Bank and tried to cash it. Did you have an account at First Citrus? No, my parents did. Did they cash the check for you? No, I used their account number to cash the check. If the check was returned for any reason, their account number would have been debited. Their account meaning your parents' account, right? So there would be a record of maybe Citrus Bank would have had a record. They should, yeah. Now, you got $1,500. I mean, when you cashed the check, signed on the back, right? And you got $1,500 once you cashed the check. And the check, now, who was the check made payable to? And David Gore says to him, you personally, right. And do you remember what bank it was drawn on? I think it was the Atlanta Bank. The Atlantic Bank? That's as far as I know. In Vero Beach? No. That was in the Orlando area. And was it a personal check or was it a business check? It was a company check. So to the best of your knowledge, it was a company check and you know the name of the company? And David Gore says D&F Auto Specialist. The payee on the check was David Allen Gore. So in the letter to me, he mentions Barnett Bank. And this is kind of how he twists things. And well, sure, if you looked at Barnett Bank, I don't know if he had an account or not, but nothing would have been there because it was actually his account. The check was written on Atlantic Bank and cashed at Citrus Bank in Vero Beach. And so he's then asked, do you have an account at the time anywhere? No. He asked, so the prosecutor asked him, can you tell us what you did with the $1,500? And David Gore says, built a room on the back of my house. So another thing that Fred Waterfield tried to say about in defense of what he's been convicted of 2 life sentences with the 2 14-year-olds, he said that the van that the police or that the sheriff's department said that he used to abduct them, it couldn't have been. So Fred moved back to Vero Beach. He closed his shop in Orlando, May of 1983. And I read the report of Patricia Winder. Fred Waterfield moved back in May of 1983. And of course, that's when the murders occurred that he's convicted of. So I read the testimony of Patricia Charlotte Winder, which is the daughter of the person that owns the van. The mother owns the van. But in this, she said that Fred Waterfield took the van and drove it to Vero Beach. So it was drivable in May of 1983. When were the girls murdered, Barbara and Angelica?
May 20, 1983.
Yeah. So was the van drivable? I would think that it was. Now, another interesting thing, when this young lady came down to Vero to pick up the van, Fred was already incarcerated. And the prosecutor asked her, was there anything wrong with the van that you didn't remember being wrong with it before? And she said, well, yeah. The dashboard was cracked. The driver's side handle was hanging. You could still open it, but it was hanging. And then the cap that goes over the interior light was taken off. And it makes you wonder, Stephanie, if that was an easy way to pull the bulb out so that when they opened the door, you couldn't see who was in the van or what was going on. And this is just, again, just a observation.
Right. They were optimizing for kidnapping, and maybe the dash was cracked and the handle was broken because of a struggle.
Maybe the prostitute, right, in Daytona, they wanted her to get in the van and she refused to get in the back. She would only get in the front of the van. And then as soon as David Gore, sitting on an ice chest in the back, pulled a gun on her, she escaped. A fight ensued and she jumped out of the van and saved herself. And then they moved on and ended up, unfortunately, finding the 2 14-year-olds.
Yeah, so just speculation, but that maybe was responsible for that damage.
Right. It is just speculation.
So basically, in all of these letters from Fred, he's telling you the same thing over and over again, that he's a victim and there's a conspiracy and everyone's involved.
Right. Including the credit card company. When they got him on the Barbara and Angelica, he said that, or I guess the prosecutor may have said, if it was a conspiracy, then the credit card company would have had to have been involved because they had his signature signing for the gas for the van.
Exactly.
My correspondence with Fred Waterfield was, him basically giving us this monotonous conspiracy theory of it couldn't have been him because, and one of the ones, he finally answered me on, why he's saying he's innocent of the crimes that he was convicted of, which were the two 14-year-olds that they picked up hitchhiking. He says that, the detectives said he used a particular van that was a client's van that he had in his shop and was fixing. And he said, but there's no way that it could have been that van. And here is what he said. The van was a Canadian GMC that had special steering gearbox that American-made models was not compatible with for replacement. I had been looking for several weeks to find a used gearbox that would work and actually purchased it on May 19th. If you'll remember, Stephanie, the girls were killed between May 19th and May 20th, 1983, but had not installed it because there was a bunch more work that was needed before the box was installed, like straightening the frame in the area where the box is bolted. The steering box has a case-hardened shaft called a Ziggurat gear, which is over 2 inches in diameter. The van hit with such force, it sheared the shaft off, blah, 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 blah. And he goes on as to why it wasn't operable. And what we had talked about before was that it had been driven before the date of these girls being kidnapped down to Vero Beach. But now he's saying that it's up on a lift. Well, recently, in this past week, Lieutenant Michael Pierce, I asked him for the owner of the van's file. Along with the owner of the van, which was Patricia Winder, I received the invoice that she had been given by Fred Waterfield. Now, in the list of every item that was purchased for this van to fix it is line itemed, and the price is next to it. And the second line item, what is that, Stephanie?
That is a steering box.
Yes, it is. $500. Now, and this is all filled out, equaling $924.83. So there's a lot of parts.
And what is the date on that?
Well, before I get to that, Miss Steph, he also, under descriptions, he says, I pulled out the front right fender and bumper, replaced headlights, battery, and steering box, repaired complete front suspension on right side, repaired and replaced front right tire. So these are all things that he did. And yes, the date on that is February 15th, 1983. And the girls were kidnapped between May 19th and May 20th. And murdered. So everything that he said to me in that letter defending himself against the murders, well, it's just been debunked.
Exactly.
Because that van was fixed February of 1983. But we are Varied Voices podcast, and it was important that we had Fred Waterfield's voice heard. And we also invited his family, including I did message back and forth with Michelle, who I think is, from what I can tell, has carried on with her life and has a very nice life despite having this legacy of a father that was convicted of being a serial killer. And I would have loved to have had her voice, but it was her choice, and I honor that. The next things that we want to do, there were 4 survivors, 3 survivors that gave reports of being victims of David Allen Gore and Fred Waterfield. Give a voice to Regan Martin, Angela Hummel, and Diane Sullivan Smalley next.